Don't be too lazy, Jonathan. Every time you will be sitting down here doing nothing.
Go out there and look for a job.
Please. I don't have anywhere to go. Just give me more time. Things will change, I promise.
No. We're tired of taking care of a grown-up man.
Imagine losing everything you thought you were, sleeping in a room that isn't yours, being reminded every single day that you're a burden, and then, 5 weeks later, signing your name on a $1.9 billion government contract. This is not a movie. This is what happened to a man named Jonathan Carter from Phoenix, Arizona, and by the time this story ends, you're going to think differently about every person you've ever looked down on. Welcome back to the channel. If this is your first time here, we tell real, raw stories about people who hit rock bottom and found a way to rise. The kind of stories that remind you that dignity isn't about your bank account, it's about what you do when nobody believes in you anymore. Before we get into today's story, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because stories like this one are exactly what this channel is built on. Now, let's get into it. Jonathan Carter was 38 years old when his world fell apart the first time. He had spent almost 15 years working in logistics and supply chain management for a mid-sized manufacturing company outside of Phoenix. He wasn't rich, but he was steady. He had a good reputation, a strong work ethic, and a marriage to a woman named Rachel that he was proud of. Rachel worked as a nurse at a regional hospital, and for years the two of them had built a quiet, comfortable life together, in a rented townhouse on the edge of the city. Then the layoffs came. It wasn't personal. The company was restructuring, moving part of its operations overseas, and 300 jobs were cut in a single afternoon. Jonathan was one of them. He remembered the exact words his supervisor used. "It's not about your performance, Jonathan. It's the numbers." "I'm sorry." He remembered walking out to his truck in the parking lot with a small cardboard box under his arm, staring at the windshield for almost 20 minutes before he could bring himself to drive home. At first, he wasn't worried. He had almost 11 years of experience, a clean record, and he believed, genuinely believed, that another job would come quickly. He updated his resume that same week. He applied to logistics companies, distribution centers, government subcontractors, anything remotely close to his skill set. But month after month, the interviews trickled in, and the offers never came. Companies were tightening their belts. Automation was replacing warehouse coordination roles. And at 38, in some rooms, he was suddenly not quite the fit they were looking for, a phrase that started to feel like a slow, repeated insult. 6 months into unemployment, the savings were gone. Rachel's nursing salary alone couldn't cover the rent, the car payment, the insurance, and the slow trickle of unexpected expenses that come with simply being alive in America. They made the hard decision to give up the townhouse and move in with Rachel's parents in a suburb outside of Tucson, just until Jonathan got back on his feet. It was supposed to be temporary. 3 months, maybe 4. Rachel's parents, Gerald and Susan Whitmore, lived in a large brick house with a finished basement, the kind of home that had been paid off for over a decade. Gerald had spent 30 years working for the state before retiring with a full pension, and Susan had run a small accounting business out of the house for most of her adult life. They weren't cruel people, not at first. They welcomed their daughter and son-in-law with open arms, set up the basement as a private living space, and told Jonathan not to worry, that family takes care of family. But 3 months became 6, 6 became 9, and somewhere around month 5, the tone in that house started to shift. It began with small comments. Gerald would ask, almost casually, over dinner, "Any luck today, Jonathan?" And when the answer was no, again, there would be a pause, a look exchanged between Gerald and Susan, a silence that said more than words ever could. Susan started mentioning, a little too often, how much groceries cost these days, how the water bill had gone up because there were 4 adults in the house instead of 2. She wasn't wrong about the numbers, but she said it in front of Jonathan every single time, like she wanted him to feel the weight of every dollar he wasn't bringing in. Jonathan wasn't lazy. He wasn't hiding in the basement playing video games while everyone else worked. He was up by 6 every morning, showered, dressed like he had somewhere to be, sending out applications, driving to job fairs 2 counties over, taking online certification courses in project management and federal contracting, because he'd read that government work was more stable than private industry. He picked up odd jobs where he could, hauling furniture for a moving company on weekends, doing landscaping for cash, anything that brought in even $100 so he could hand Susan something. Anything, to prove he wasn't just taking. But in that house, effort didn't seem to count. Only results did. By month 7, Gerald stopped making small comments and started making direct ones. Jonathan remembered one dinner in particular, a Tuesday in early March, when Gerald set his fork down and said, in front of Rachel, "Jonathan, I love you like a son, but a man's supposed to provide. I built this house with my own 2 hands, paycheck by paycheck. My daughter deserves a husband who can do the same. I don't see that happening under my roof anymore." Jonathan sat there and took it. What could he say? He had no offer letter to wave in Gerald's face. He had no rebuttal that would land harder than the truth sitting in front of him. He was 39 years old, living in his in-laws' basement, unable to provide for his wife the way he'd promised he would on their wedding day. Rachel tried to defend him in private, telling her parents he was doing everything he could, that the job market was brutal for men his age in his field, that this wasn't a character flaw, it was bad timing colliding with bad luck. But even Rachel, exhausted from 12-hour hospital shifts and the tension in her childhood home, started to change. Not because she stopped loving him, but because watching someone she loved get quietly humiliated at every meal, day after day, wears a person down too. Some nights she'd come down to the basement and just sit next to him in silence, not because she had nothing to say, but because she didn't know what would help anymore. Then came the night that changed everything. It was a Sunday evening in late March. Susan had invited her sister and brother-in-law over for dinner, people Jonathan had met maybe twice before. Somewhere between the pot roast and the dessert, the conversation turned to jobs, to the economy, to kids these days not knowing the value of hard work, even though Jonathan was pushing 40. And then Susan's sister asked, not unkindly but carelessly, "So Jonathan, still no luck finding something?" Before Jonathan could answer, Gerald cut in. "He's been looking for almost a year now." He said the word looking with air quotes, like it was a joke everyone at the table was supposed to laugh at. A few people chuckled awkwardly. Jonathan felt his face go hot. Rachel's hand found his under the table, but it wasn't enough to stop what was building in his chest. After the guests left that night, Gerald came down to the basement. Jonathan remembered every word of what came next, because it was the moment the ground finally gave way beneath him completely. "I think it's time you found somewhere else to figure your life out," Gerald said. "This isn't working. You're not contributing. You're not providing for my daughter. And frankly, Jonathan, I don't think you're even trying hard enough. A real man finds a way. I don't want to see my daughter stuck taking care of a grown man who can't take care of himself." Jonathan tried to explain. The applications, the courses, the odd jobs, the interviews that went nowhere through no fault of his own. But Gerald wasn't listening anymore. He'd made up his mind. And 2 days later, standing in the driveway with 2 suitcases and a duffel bag, Jonathan was told, in front of Rachel, that he needed to leave. Not permanently from the marriage. Rachel made that painfully clear, crying, holding onto his arm, telling her father this wasn't right. But from the house. Immediately. Rachel couldn't leave with him. Her job, her family, the practical realities of a hospital schedule and a lease she wasn't on, kept her rooted there for the time being. So Jonathan did the only thing he could. He packed what little he had into his old pickup truck, and he drove to an extended stay motel off the interstate, the kind of place with weekly rates and a flickering vending machine in the lobby, and he checked into a single room with a bed, a microwave, and a window that looked out onto a parking lot. That first night, alone in that motel room, Jonathan said later that he hit the lowest point of his entire life. Not because he'd lost a job, not because he'd lost a house, but because the people who were supposed to see his worth, his wife's own family, had looked at him and decided he had none. He sat on the edge of that motel bed with his laptop open, the job application tab still loaded from that morning, and for the first time in almost a year, he let himself cry. Not out of self-pity, but out of sheer exhaustion, from trying so hard for so long, with nothing to show for it. But here's something important about people like Jonathan. The ones who get knocked down the hardest sometimes get back up the fastest, not because they're stronger than everyone else, but because they've got nothing left to lose. And that motel room, as pathetic as it looked from the outside, became the place where Jonathan stopped trying to prove himself to Gerald Whitmore and started trying to prove something to himself instead. The very next morning, Jonathan didn't wallow. He drove to the public library in downtown Tucson because his data plan had been shut off from missed payments, and he used their free Wi-Fi to keep applying. But this time, something in him shifted. Instead of applying only to private logistics companies that kept rejecting him, he leaned all the way into something he'd been studying quietly for months: federal contracting. See, months earlier, back when he was still living in that basement, Jonathan had stumbled across a certification course for something called Federal Acquisition and Government Contracting Compliance. It was tedious material: regulations, bid procedures, small business set-aside programs, GSA schedules, the kind of dry, technical stuff most people skip past. But Jonathan had years of logistics and supply chain experience, and he noticed something nobody else around him seemed to notice. The federal government spends hundreds of billions of dollars every single year on contracts for supply chain management, transportation, warehousing, and logistics support for military and civilian agencies. And most of the companies bidding on these contracts were desperate for people who actually understood operations from the ground up. Not just paperwork, but real, hands-on logistics experience. Jonathan had finished that certification just 2 weeks before he was kicked out. And now, sitting in that library with nothing but a laptop, a library card, and a burning need to prove Gerald Whitmore wrong, he started reaching out directly to small and mid-sized government contracting firms, the kind of companies that don't have flashy offices, but that quietly win multi-million-dollar federal contracts every single year. He found one in particular, a woman-owned small business based out of Northern Virginia called Cardinal Point Logistics Solutions, run by a founder named Angela Foster. The company specialized in supply chain and logistics support for federal agencies, and they were in the middle of preparing a massive bid for a Department of Defense contract, a multi-year logistics and distribution support contract for military bases across multiple states. The bid required someone with deep operational logistics experience who could help build out the technical proposal, someone who understood warehousing, transportation networks, and supply chain bottlenecks from real-world experience, not just theory. Jonathan sent Angela a message through a professional networking site late on a Tuesday night, from a motel room, on a laptop running on 11% battery. He didn't dress it up. He told her exactly who he was: a logistics professional with 15 years of hands-on experience, recently laid off, freshly certified in federal contracting compliance, hungry for an opportunity to prove himself on real work. He attached his resume, he hit send, and then he plugged his dying laptop into the motel room's single working outlet and went to sleep, not knowing if anyone would ever respond. 3 days later, Angela Foster called him. She told him later that most of the resumes she gets are polished and safe and forgettable. But something about Jonathan's message stood out: the honesty, the specificity of his operational experience, the fact that he clearly understood real warehouse and transportation logistics from the floor level, not just from a textbook. She brought him in for what was supposed to be a short phone interview. It turned into a 90-minute conversation. By the end of it, Angela offered him a short-term consulting role, helping Cardinal Point put together the technical and operational sections of their bid proposal for the Department of Defense contract. It wasn't a full-time job yet, it wasn't life-changing money, but it was work. Real, meaningful work, in the exact field he'd spent a year trying to break into. Jonathan said yes before she even finished the sentence. For the next 4 weeks, Jonathan worked harder than he had ever worked in his life. He drove down to Northern Virginia and back multiple times, sleeping in his truck once, when the motel bills got tight and the consulting payment hadn't cleared yet. He spent long nights building out logistics flowcharts, transportation route optimization models, and staffing plans based on real operational data from his old job, adapted and scaled up for military-level distribution needs. Angela later said that Jonathan brought something to that proposal that none of her in-house staff could: the instincts of someone who had actually managed a loading dock, actually dealt with delayed shipments, actually solved real problems in the field, not just on paper. The bid was submitted on a Friday afternoon in early May. Cardinal Point Logistics Solutions, alongside 2 larger partner firms, had put together a joint proposal for a Department of Defense multi-year logistics and distribution support contract valued at just under $2 billion. A contract that would provide transportation, warehousing, and supply chain management support across multiple military installations for the next several years. Jonathan went back to his motel room that night, not expecting much. Government contracts of that size usually take months to be awarded, sometimes longer, and the competition included firms far larger and more established than Cardinal Point. He figured, realistically, that even if they lost this one, he'd gain something priceless: real experience, a mentor in Angela, and proof to himself that he still had value in this industry. But 5 weeks after he had stood in that driveway in Tucson with 2 suitcases, humiliated in front of his own wife, Jonathan got a phone call from Angela Foster that he said he will remember for the rest of his life. Cardinal Point Logistics Solutions, as the lead operational subcontractor in the joint venture, had won the contract, $1.9 billion, awarded by the Department of Defense for logistics and distribution support across military installations, spanning several years. And because of the direct, hands-on role Jonathan had played in building the technical proposal, the exact proposal that the evaluators had specifically praised for its operationally grounded, field-tested approach to distribution logistics, Angela didn't just thank him and cut ties. She offered him a permanent position as Director of Logistics Operations for the new contract, with a salary and equity stake that, for a man who had been living out of a motel room and sometimes his truck 5 weeks earlier, felt almost unreal. Jonathan said he sat in his truck in that motel parking lot after hanging up the phone, and he didn't cry the way he had that first lonely night. This time, he laughed, out loud, alone, until the laughter turned into something closer to disbelief. The first person he called wasn't his mother. It wasn't a friend. It was Rachel. He told her everything, and Rachel, who had spent the last 5 weeks torn between loyalty to her parents and love for her husband, broke down crying on the phone, telling him how proud she was, how she never once stopped believing in him, even when it felt like everyone else around her had. Jonathan didn't rush back to Gerald and Susan's house to throw the news in their faces, even though a part of him wanted to. Instead, he did something quieter, and honestly, more powerful. He and Rachel found a new place together, a real apartment, in their own name, that he could now afford comfortably on his own. And Rachel moved out of her parents' house within 2 weeks. When Gerald found out about the contract, not from Jonathan directly, but from Rachel, casually, over the phone, there was a long silence before Gerald simply said, "I had no idea." Jonathan said later that those 4 words meant more to him than any apology ever could have, because they proved something he'd known all along. Gerald hadn't kicked him out because he actually believed Jonathan wasn't trying. He'd kicked him out because he judged a man's worth purely by the number in his bank account, without ever seeing the effort behind it. Jonathan and Rachel now live outside Alexandria, Virginia, close to Cardinal Point's headquarters. He still keeps in touch with Gerald and Susan. Family is complicated, and Jonathan said he chose forgiveness over bitterness, because carrying that resentment forward would have cost him more than it ever cost them. But their relationship changed permanently that day. Jonathan is no longer the man Gerald quietly judged at that dinner table. And Gerald, to his credit, has since told Jonathan more than once how proud he is of him, though Jonathan is quick to point out, with a small laugh, that pride is easy to hand out after the win. The real test of a person's character is what they say to you before you've proven anything at all. Now here's what I want you to take from Jonathan's story, because this channel isn't just about telling you what happened, it's about helping you see something in your own life through someone else's struggle. If you are watching this right now and you feel like you're being judged for where you are instead of where you're going, please hear this. Your current circumstances are not a life sentence on your character. A layoff, a setback, a season of struggling to provide, none of that defines your worth as a person, no matter how loudly the people around you might suggest otherwise. Jonathan didn't win that contract because he got lucky. He won it because during the months when everyone around him saw a man who was failing, he was quietly building skills, taking certifications, learning an entire new industry from scratch, one late night at a time, when nobody was clapping for him and nobody believed it would ever pay off. That's the part people miss. The turnaround didn't happen in 5 weeks. Those 5 weeks were simply when the world finally saw what had actually been building for almost a year in silence. If you're in a season right now where you feel like a burden, where people close to you are running out of patience, I want you to understand something important. Their patience running out doesn't mean your effort isn't real. Keep showing up. Keep learning. Keep applying. Keep building. Keep refusing to quit on yourself even when the people who are supposed to support you the most decide to give up on you first. And if you're on the other side of this, if you're someone who has a family member going through a hard season right now, someone who's struggling to find work, struggling to provide, struggling to feel like they have value, please, be Rachel in this story, not Gerald. Choose patience over judgment. Choose belief over criticism. Because you never know if the person sitting quietly at your dinner table, absorbing every disappointed look you give them, is 5 weeks away from changing their entire life. And even if they're not 5 weeks away from a big win, they still deserve to be treated with dignity while they fight for one. If this story moved you even a little, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button right now, because we've got dozens more stories just like this one. Real people, real setbacks, real comebacks, waiting for you. Drop a comment and let me know. Have you ever been counted out by the people closest to you, only to prove them wrong later? I read every single comment, and I would genuinely love to hear your story. And before you go, share this video with someone in your life who needs to hear it today. Someone who's struggling right now and needs a reminder that their current chapter is not their final one. Thank you so much for watching all the way to the end. Take care of yourself, believe in your own timeline, and I will see you in the next story.
Please subscribe to my YouTube channel and support me. Thank you so much. I love you all. Bye!